Phone a friend? Well, maybe. President Trump and new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney connect on the phone for the very first time. That conversation comes after the president, that is to say President Trump, announced new tariffs on foreign cars and car parts implicating trade with Canada, to be sure. Today, the president sounded a bit more positive about the relationship with our neighbors to the north. The Prime Minister of Canada, well, judge for yourself.
We're going to end up with a very good relationship with Canada and a lot of the other countries. Some we probably won't. It won't be so pleasant.
Canada is strong, but we're even stronger when we are united. And our response to these latest tariffs is to fight, to protect, and to build.
Speaking of tariffs, there was quite a bit of turmoil in the markets over tariffs. Investors dumped stocks, and the Dow dropped hundreds of points, more than 700, as you can see there. Uncertainty grows around U.S. trade policy, and there is a more grim outlook on inflation. Meanwhile, consumer sentiment fell to its lowest level in more than 2 years. Workers and laborers and consumers appear worried about the direction of the overall U.S. economy. Also, talking a takeover. Vice President Vance and Second Lady Usha Vance visit a U.S. military base in Greenland, while President Trump says taking the Danish territory is, quote, very important for the peace of the world. I want to start tonight with Ed O'Keefe at the White House. Ed, catch us up on the call between Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, and President Trump, and what it might portend.
Well, it finally happened, Major. There had been reports the last 2 days about whether or not this was going to happen or if it had already happened. And coming out of it, it seems the president seems to like Mark, as he called him, Mark Carney, the current Prime Minister of Canada, saying that ultimately we're going to have a positive relationship, and seemed to otherwise let it go, publicly at least. Got to remember that right now Prime Minister Carney is in the midst of a re-election or election fight, depending on how you want to define it. He actually has to run for a seat himself in Parliament because he doesn't have one right now. It's a long story. But you have to see his participation in this through that lens, that he is very much wrapped up in his own political future. And so talking tough and continuing to talk about the idea that Canada has to be more self-reliant or seek other alliances around the world is part of his pitch, that he essentially is a technocrat who once ran the Central Bank of Canada, the Central Bank of Britain, or England, made a living as a executive and a banker that has demonstrated to Canadians, at least according to public opinion polls, that he seems best equipped to deal with the United States, has to continue to talk tough and be serious and somewhat strong about it all. And so he seemed to do that. Trump, of course, someone you and I both know, likes guys that talk tough negotiators. And so in essence, what the president seemed to be signaling today is that they're going to put it off until after April 28th, when Canadians are set to decide which party will control Parliament. Important to point out, ever since the president started this talk of annexation and of tariffs, the ruling Liberal Party came from a 20-point deficit to the opposition Conservatives, and now is forecasted in recent polling this week to probably get just enough seats to potentially take the majority and wouldn't even need to form a unity government, all thanks to Donald Trump. So how Carney deals with him in the next few weeks will determine who controls Canada.
Ed, keeping our political gaze ever northward, let's talk about Greenland and the vice president's trip, what it was about, the context around it, and also some of the conversation that the vice president had about the Signal chat room that is attracted justifiably so much attention here in Washington for the week.
So initially, we'd learned earlier this week that the Second Lady of the United States and one of the Vance children, plus the National Security Advisor, were going to take trips, plural, to Greenland. By the end of the week, it was one trip, and it only lasted a few hours, and they all went together. And best we can tell, Major, they didn't actually meet a Greenlander. They only went to the U.S. Space Force base in northern Greenland, spent a few hours there learning about the operations, and are now on their way back. There were reports in the Danish media up in Greenland this week that there had been advanced staffers in Greenland trying to find locals willing to meet with Mrs. Vance, and that these Americans that were doing this work were repeatedly rebuffed. So that may have something to do with why it is this was such a quick trip, and one that only went to the Space Force base and didn't involve what we had originally been told would be attending a dog sled race, because I guess that's one of the things they do up there, and there is a big one this week. At the end of a briefing, he did speak with the reporters who were traveling, and he was asked about his participation in that Signal group chat that was revealed this week by the Atlantic magazine. And the vice president had this to say about the conversation that had unfolded over those texts. Take a listen.
What I saw in that signal chat, and of course what I've seen in the president's senior national security team, is that sometimes we all agree and sometimes we all disagree, but it's important that we all have an honest conversation amongst ourselves and with the president of the United States about what we think is the best interest of the national security of the United States of America.
And that is in speaking specifically to the fact that he raised some concerns in these chats about, A, whether or not these strikes should be conducted at all, B, whether we were in essence doing something on behalf of Europe, since more of its commercial shipping goes through the Red Sea and passes by Yemen and had been threatened by Houthi rebels, and then raised questions about how exactly this was going to be sold to or explained to the American people. Now, all of that is the kind of substantive, meaty policy and messaging conversation that very well does happen in administrations when they're making big decisions like this, especially around military operations. But normally it happens in the Situation Room or the Oval Office behind guarded doors and not on unsecure, commercially available apps. And, of course, that was the big difference. And also not surprising that a vice president might play devil's advocate. You covered the Bush years. Former Vice President Joe Biden always raised concerns during the Obama years, especially about military operations. It's no surprise a VP would do that. It's just that we got to see it, in essence, play out over text messages when normally it's private conversations.
We got to see it, and lots of other people, not all of them friends of the United States or our national security priorities, saw it too. Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thanks so very much. Jolene Kent joins me now to discuss the markets, tariffs, and kind of a wild day on Wall Street. Jolene, break it down.
Hi, Major. That's right. We saw the S&P 500, that broader index, tumble by about 2%. You saw major auto stocks get hit by this anxiety that is driving through the markets right now about three particular things: consumer behavior, inflation data, as well as what tariffs could bring next week. So as we look at what happened today, you saw the Dow down 1.7%, the NASDAQ down almost 3%, and the S&P 500 tanking that 2% that we just talked about. But what we see overall is a lot of this is pegged on PCE data. We're talking about personal consumer expenditures. That's the favorite data point on inflation for the Federal Reserve, which of course controls interest rates. And basically one great example that we saw that really materialized here in February, people spent 10% more on groceries, and they spent 15% less on going out to eat. And so that kind of tells you where consumer sentiment might be when it comes to those week-to-week expenses. And that's where you see a lot of this hedging and concern about the overall uncertainty about personal financial situations, as well as what things are going to cost going forward, Major.
And Jolene, you spent a lot of time in this space. I try to keep my ears and eyes open to this space, meaning the stock market, economic indicators, and data. And one of the things that's emerged, certainly in the last month, is a sense that the market doesn't know how to price either the tariffs or expected consumer reaction to it. So they don't know where to go, and they don't know where investments might best land. That seems to be driving a lot of this volatility.
Yes, uncertainty is the word that I keep hearing from so many of the experts, economists, consumers, small business owners, tech CEOs and executives who I've been talking to over the past several days. Where is this going to go? We still don't have clarity, for example, on possible reciprocal tariffs that may come as early as next Wednesday on April 2nd. And so all of this has companies feeling very uncertain. One small business owner that I know who works in components and sort of widgets and supplies was saying that he wished that he knew exactly what was coming, or at least more of a semblance of such a thing, so he could deal with his Canadian trading partners better. And as a result, you see, Canadian leadership acting before we know exactly what's going to be laid out next week. So it's that uncertainty is rocking a lot of people, both psychologically and in terms of their earnings calls and their stock prices and so forth.
When there is uncertainty, there is typically a flight of capital to safety. Capital just doesn't know where the safest place is right now. Jolene Kent.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, gold did very well today, hitting some all-time highs.
The old reliable precious metals. Jolene Kent, thank you very much.
Thanks, Major.